And as we begin this chapter, there could be a picture in your head of David, quite a young man, not quite a boy, I don't think, but a young man standing before Saul holding Goliath's head in his hand, because that's what's been happening. Those were brutal days, but today are brutal days, aren't they? We only have to look at the world we're living in. The war in Myanmar, the brutality of that, the war in Ukraine, the brutality of that, and people who pick holes in the Old Testament saying it's brutal have got blind eyes, because we live in a brutal world. It's a world of unkindness, a world of savagery so often. And those were the days that David was living in. The enemy, the Philistines, were desperately barbaric people. They were seeking, as some still are to this day, the destruction of Israel. And David was God's man to defend his people against these great enemies. And we've got three things to look at in this passage, and we'll look at them as briefly as we can. The first 4 verses, Matthew's already touched upon that, but I want to give you a heading to fix some thoughts on it. The heading is The Godly Understanding of Jonathan. The Godly Understanding of Jonathan, because it is about friendship, but it's not only about friendship, and we need to understand that. I mean, clearly, David and Jonathan were drawn to each other. And in particular, in this passage, we're told that Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Jonathan was older. Jonathan was a campaign-hardened soldier. We've read about Jonathan earlier. He's been going out to battle against the Philistines. And he senses a kindred spirit here in this young man, David. Here's another man who's going to be like him, ready to take the enemy on. Now, some modern commentators have made this into some sort of homosexual relationship. There is nothing in any of the words used in this passage to suggest any such thing. It was a manly friendship. And friends are wonderful things. Matthew mentioned to the children about how in their children's stories they get these friendship images coming through. Of course, the one that comes to me is Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. There's that closeness to one another, isn't there? You read that story, the loyalty that comes out in that story. And, of course, many of us have friends that we've had for a long, long time. I've got a particular friend now that I've known since 6 months after we moved to Tenterden. We moved in 1979, and he and his family came to this church about 6 months later, and we've been the closest friends ever since. Although we don't see each other all that often, we talk on the phone now and again, but whenever we meet each other, it's as if nothing's changed. We're close friends, and that's what we've got here. Jonathan was drawn to David as a brother, as a kindred spirit. And there's something warm about such things, isn't there, between men or women. I think women tend to be better at friendships than men, and have a lot more friendships, and that's a great thing as well. But friendship is important, and we should be thankful for the love and friendship of brothers and sisters, as David was for Jonathan. But you see this much more here, because we read that Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Actually, the words in the original give a much more clear picture of what was happening here. David cut a covenant. Jonathan cut a covenant with David. Now, that sounds weird to us, but actually, if you go back to Genesis chapter 15, you'll find a biblical origin of it, but it's believed not to have been biblical entirely in origin, when you have God coming to Abraham and telling him to have these birds, these animals killed, and then split in half and put half either side, and then God passes through, making a covenant. So the picture is, there's a death, there's a division, and then you make the covenant by walking through the middle. What are you saying? You're saying, if I break my promise, may I be like these dead animals. That's what you're saying. And that's what Jonathan was saying to David. If I break my promise to you, may I be like these dead animals. So it's not just a matter of words, but actions. And this was a serious thing that Jonathan was doing in his relationship with David. Why was he doing it? Well, you see, Jonathan was a godly man. He was listening, hearing what was going on. Perhaps he'd heard by this stage that Samuel had gone and anointed David. Perhaps, I don't know. But perhaps some whisper of that had come to him. Because what he does now is incredible. Jonathan recognized God's choice of David as king. What does he do? He takes off his armor. He takes off his insignia. He takes off his sword. And he gives them to David. Now what he's been doing is standing there as the king's son, as the heir apparent. And now he's saying to David, you are the heir apparent, not me. And I recognize that. Do you know, it's a wonderful thing to recognize God's gifts in others. It's a wonderful thing to acknowledge that a gift that I don't have, somebody else has. And God has provided it. And I shouldn't be jealous of it. I should be thankful for it. And that's something we could all learn. You see, John the Baptist, when he was at the height of his fame in Israel, when he was a great preacher, and he encountered Jesus, what did he say? He must increase, and I must decrease. He saw and recognized and honored God. Most wonderfully, however, is our Lord Jesus Christ. Because there's another picture here, isn't there? When Jonathan passed that clothing over to David, David didn't immediately become the king. It may have been an indication that Jonathan understood God's plans and purposes, but David didn't immediately become the king. And yet the scriptures tell us that if we come to God in Jesus Christ, who is the friend who sticketh closer than a brother, as we've heard speaking to the children, but the way he saves us is by putting his righteousness onto us. His clothing, if you like, is put onto us. And in God's eyes, we become him, the righteousness of God. How amazing is that? What a wonderful picture that is. And that's part of the picture that we see here. Clothed in his righteousness alone, faultless, I stand before the throne. See, that hymn writer understood it. He got it. And that's what happens to everyone who comes to Jesus for salvation. You know, it wasn't that much later before Jonathan began to learn just how costly the promise he made to David was going to be for him. But that's for another day. So, the godly understanding of Jonathan. And then, secondly, in this chapter, we learn about the desperate envy of Saul. Well, we've begun to see in the last few studies the way that Saul, who seemed to start so well, has plateaued, and now he's beginning to decline. And this decline will now continue until the sadness and tragedy of his ultimate death. But the reasons for the decline are self-inflicted. He brings it on himself. He disobeys God. He tries to act as a priest. He doesn't do what God tells him to do. We've seen all that as we've come through to here, and now we begin to see it developing in a worse way, if that is possible. He's consumed with envy of David, and it has a profound effect on his moods. There's a verse here in which an evil spirit goes out from the Lord, and some people have misunderstood that. It's not the best of translations, to be honest. The better translation would be a harmful spirit, or a spirit of unhappiness, or something like that. Distressing spirit. It's not so much a moral issue as a judgment from God on Saul, because Saul has turned away from God, and God is in control of all circumstances. Some circumstances are very bad and very difficult, but God is in control. God was in control when the devil tempted Job, and God was in control when wicked men took Jesus and crucified him. We must never forget that. And here in the life of Saul, we begin to see that God is in control, whether good or bad. And we need to remind ourselves as we read this that envy is a terrible sin. That being envious of others is a terrible sin. And we've really got to try to face up to the reality of it and seek with all our hearts to be free from it. Now look how it affects Saul here. First of all, we see Saul getting upset about a song. Not upset because the words were emotional and moving, but upset because they said David kills 10,000 and I only kill thousands. I don't suppose that either is particularly true. They're hyperbole. They are exaggerated for effect. These women are singing, how fantastic is David. Now you'd think that the king who is fighting for his throne against a brutal enemy would be delighted to have somebody who is killing 10,000. But no, Saul is envious. He doesn't like it. And he looks at David with a jealous eye, rather than being thankful to God for giving him a soldier like David. And then Saul begins to suffer serious mood swings. Envy makes us dissatisfied with our own lives and angry about what others have, perhaps causing us to fly off the handle and lose self-control. I was reading in the paper yesterday that there was a golfer, an American golfer, professional golfer, who actually went onto the golf course yesterday with his mouth taped up because he could not control himself on the golf course. And he thought that this was a way he might be able to control himself, and he thought that it was unfair to the other golfers because he kept shouting and throwing. Well, I don't know how it went for him, but I do know that there are people like that, aren't they? Aren't there? There are people that fly off the handle. And this was clearly the case with Saul. I mean, we hear that at least twice here, and we'll find out there were more times later, he tried to pin David to the wall with his spear. You can see him sitting there, can't you, with his throne, and David's playing his harp and trying to keep the thing calm, and then suddenly Saul, and David dodges it and goes away, and somebody comes up to him and says, don't worry about that, David, you know Saul. 1 minute he's fine, next minute he loses his rag. Just let it go. Oh no, but in Saul now, you never know quite what you're going to get. And then Saul is afraid. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David. And envy can make us a fear for our future. Suddenly, everyone is a potential enemy. Don't know whether you've ever read, there's a fantastic biography of Stalin written by that well-known man, Simon Sebag Montefiore. Great name, isn't it? But he's a very good historian. And what comes out if you read it, it is a bit of a big book, got to be honest. But what comes out was the paranoia of Stalin. He thought they were all out to get him. And they were all scared stiff of him because they knew that he thought they were all out to get him. And his moods were such that one day they could go in there and there would be a list of the names of the people to be shot today, and their name might be on it. Envy can do that. And envy makes you devious. See the way that Saul's deviousness comes out in the way he first of all promises David his daughter Merab. And we might say, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, no, it's not strange, is it? Isn't that what he promised to the person who killed Goliath? If you read chapter 17, wasn't that the promise? The man who kills Goliath will have one of my daughters in marriage. Oh, he's forgotten all about that now, hasn't he? And then perhaps he thinks to himself, oh, well, that would be a good idea. So serve me well and bravely in the battles against the Philistines. Get out there. Don't be sitting here. Go out and fight the war. Put yourself in danger. And I'll give you my daughter in marriage. Of course, we know his plotting is that David will be killed. And that comes out again later with the somewhat tacky end of the chapter. It's odd for us to think that, but what it comes down to is this. Go out and kill 100 of the enemy and bring me evidence that you've killed them. What's his hope? His hope is that when he's out there, the enemy will kill him. He's devious. So Saul is now an enemy of both God and David. Verse 28, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. Here's his best soldier. Here's a man who Saul knows that the Lord is with him. And he's his enemy. So he's God's enemy as well. This is what envy can do. How do we deal with envy in our lives? Well, have this mind in you, which you also have in Christ Jesus. Philippians chapter 2, who did not think it wrong, commit robbery, to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took on him the form of a servant, and being made in likeness as a man, he became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Have that mind in you. Be like Jesus. And do you know that passage follows the Apostle Paul saying to the people in Philippi, consider others better than yourselves. That's what we need to do. We need to look at people and not envy them, but to consider them better than ourselves. And then again in Philippians in chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says, I have learned to be content. Whatever the circumstances, I've learned to be content. It didn't come natural to me. I've learned it. I know how to be thankful to God for everything that I have. And perhaps even for some of the things that I don't have. So the desperate envy of Saul. But then the last thing we see here is the blessing of God's favour in David. It's a repeated theme right through the chapter. You can go through it and find the verses. I'll recite them for you now. David was blessed with success because God was establishing him as the future king. Verse 5, verse 14, verse 15, verse 30. God was with David in all he did, despite Saul's machinations and attempts to get him killed. Verse 12, verse 28. David was almost universally loved. The women came out and sang because they loved him. The soldiers loved him. The officers loved him. Michael, don't know how you pronounce the name quite. She loved him too. Verses 1, 3, 16, 20, 22, 28. See, God is working in David to bring him finally to that position of kingship. It's not that David was perfect. It's that God was merciful. And if you're a Christian, do you know that God is working in you? Every day? Every day he's working in you. He's given you such blessings, more blessings than David ever knew in Jesus Christ. He that spared not his own son, but gave him up for us all freely, how will he not with him also freely give us what? All things. All that we need. Everything that God thinks we need, he'll give us. That's his promise. And that was his promise to David, and he's fulfilling it here. He is establishing him as the king to come. We rejoice in God's love to us, in his favor to us, if we are his people. We rejoice when God blesses our fellow believers. We're glad to see fellow believers being blessed. We rejoice with those who rejoice, and we mourn with those who mourn. Because God is blessing his people, just as here he blessed David. So good and bad in one chapter, isn't it? A godly man understands what's going on, and he accepts God's plan and goes with it. An ungodly man is overwhelmed with envy, and it destroys his life. And if it was left to him alone, it would have destroyed David's life and other lives as well. Doesn't seem to have much concern for his daughters, does he? But then we find David, a man after God's own heart, not a perfect man, but a man who God is establishing as his servant. You know, sometimes when we're in a little church, as we are, we see big churches and big pastors, and we think, how wonderful. But you know, we're in the majority by a long way. Small churches are far more numerous than big churches. And humble, faithful ministers who serve God's people are not always the big speakers who can stand at the front. And we should be thankful that God provides those to lead us and keep us in his way. Amen. Well, we're going to close